All right, so we're going to talk through this thing that I have not shared my screen for yet. I'm going to call this Explain It Like I'm Front End, Ruby on Rails. I'm going to start over by going over some Ruby basics compared to JavaScript, and then we're going to get deep into the Rails weeds. Try to do that as fast as possible, but I think that having an understanding of how methods compare to functions is going to help a lot for just being able to read what you're looking at. So I don't know if this analogy is going to be perfect because my understanding of JavaScript is here, right? But as far as I can tell, a really good point of comparison between JavaScript functions and Ruby methods is in how they work in JavaScript classes. And I did some reading in about this today. JavaScript is not like totally object-oriented. It's more procedural, maybe functional. I couldn't, like, depending on which angry Quora response I looked at, you get a different answer, right? But JavaScript is most like Ruby when you are using the class construction stuff from, I think it's all ES6, pretty sure. So I took this, we're going to use this as an example, this example from the MDM box on classes. You've got this class rectangle, and the whole thing's bordered by curly braces. You've got the constructor method, which takes in some arguments and then saves them to these instance properties, right? And then you've got some, sorry, say that again? Somebody was saying something. You've got this get keyword to make a getter method. You have, and then just kind of making general methods here, right? You can make a new one with new, the class, and then the arguments. You can store it in a variable with const. You can call the getter method on that instance, right? The equivalent Ruby code would look like, oh, and I need to refresh this because I updated this. Here we go. Class rectangle. You don't have curly braces. You just have class and end. You've got something that's very close to the constructor method, which is initialize. Takes in height and width arguments, and they are saved as instance variables, which I'll explain in a second. And then you can make sort of a general purpose method very similarly. And instead of returning this dot height times this dot width, you can see I'm just doing at height times at width, and there's no return keyword. So, and you can see that the syntax for making a new instance is class.new arguments. You can save it in a variable, which looks different. I'll talk about that in a second. And then printing it to terminal, use puts instead of console.log, but you can similarly, you can call square.area. And actually, this is not a good example because I didn't define area anywhere in here, but I'll fix that later. Let's say this was calc.area. And you can see instead of making a getter method, there's some extra stuff in here called add a reader, which I'll talk about. So here are kind of the points of comparison. In Ruby, instead of having to explicitly say return, methods implicitly return the value of the last expression in the method. So whatever the last line is, whatever the calculated value of that line is what gets returned by the method as a whole. You can make that specific or explicit or force a method to return a value earlier than the last line and then break off to the execution of the method with a return keyword, just like JavaScript. Another point is that there's no end of line syntax like the semicolon in JavaScript. A line break is assumed to close an expression unless the next line starts with a period to chain methods, which I think you can also do in JavaScript. Mm-hmm. Initialize works just like constructor, like I said. Ruby prefers do and end instead of opening and closing curly braces. In some cases, such as in iteration or enumerable blocks, it'll take either. They can be interchangeable, do and end, or curly braces. But when you're defining classes or methods, the opening do is implied kind of like right here. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but it's sort of happening after the arguments. And then it's closing that block with end. Same with the class. There's an end to it, and there's sort of an implied do right here. And like I said, the equivalent of instance properties is instance variables. They're preceded with an at. Unlike instance properties, they are not accessible from outside of the class scope unless you explicitly make a getter method for them using the attr reader function. And with the attr reader function, you make a symbol. This is a Ruby data type called a symbol, which is like a local variable, but the variable itself is immutable. So it takes up one space memory. You know, we're not going to get into that, but it takes, you basically feed it the instance variable as a symbol, and it creates a getter method for that instance variable. If you don't do that, the instance variables are private to the class. So whereas with JavaScript classes, if you say this dot height equals height, I could say, you know, constant square equals new rectangle, then call square dot height, and I would have access to it. Can't do that in Ruby unless you explicitly do that. Similarly, if you want read and write access, you would do attr accessor. Same syntax. So that's how you would make a getter slash setter method. And then unlike JavaScript, if a method does not take an argument, you do not need to include parentheses after it. So you can see like initialize takes 2 arguments, calc area takes no arguments, and you just leave the parentheses off. You can put them on and Ruby will not freak out, but they're unnecessary. And it's the same thing when you're calling methods. And this must be how getter methods work, but in Ruby, I don't have to append an empty parentheses after a method call. And we'll talk about that later because that makes it sometimes difficult at a glance to tell the difference between a method and a local variable. I'll talk about some strategies for that. Before I get into scope levels, do you guys have any questions so far?
No, I think that makes sense to me. It's cool.
Yeah.
Cool comparison. It's interesting seeing the getter versus setter distinctions between the two. I think they do operate somewhat similar in terms of scoping, right? If you don't put things within your constructor in JavaScript, you might not get access. Like you don't have access to variables necessarily in the same way, and like methods. I think you got the right idea there.
Got it. Cool. And this was something I was just starting to read up on before the call started. But can I access calc area from outside of the class scope? So if I did console.log square.calc area, would I be able to get to it?
Yep. Yeah, as long as you got the parent at the end of it.
Okay, got it.
So down in the Ruby example where it says calc area and then it says puts square dot area.
Yeah.
You just kind of like skipping over the calc part.
Yeah, that was a typo.
Oh no, okay, just checking. I just wanted to make sure there wasn't like a thing.
Yes, let me fix that real quick. Yes, thank you. Yeah, I just left out the that part of it because in this scenario, by default, any instance methods that you define on the class are public. And if I see an example when we get into the dev2 code, I'll show you, but you can make, and you're encouraged to make any methods that you don't need to be public private. And the way that you would make methods private, which would limit access to them to the class scope, you just put a private keyword at some point in the class, and then everything under private is, you can only access within the class. But yeah, in this case, I can just call calc.area. All right, so I'm going to move on to scope levels, and this will be pretty brief. As probably became clear in that last example, Ruby is, as far as I can tell, much more encapsulated by default than JavaScript. So it prefers to keep data contained to its class or instance or method wherever possible. So that's a thing. In terms of what kinds of variables exist, local variables are what you'll most frequently see. They are block scoped. I think this is similar to let, and you can correct me if I'm wrong about that. They exist only for the duration of the execution of a particular block, and they're declared without any keyword. So it just looks like this: example variable equals an example value. They are mutable, so they can be reassigned as many times as you'd like, unlike const, I believe. And there is no, to my knowledge, equivalent of hoisting in Ruby. So assignment occurs in the order that the lines of code are executed. Whereas in JavaScript, correct me if I'm wrong, var, I believe, hoists. So if you assign it somewhere below, anywhere in the code, it will act as if it had been declared at the top of that block, right? Okay, same with functions, okay. So yeah, that doesn't happen. With methods, it's a little different. And with instance variables, it's a little different. So instance variables and instance methods can be accessed anywhere within the class. And there's an odd extension to that logic when it comes to controllers and views and rails, which I'll talk about later. But generally speaking, if I define a method, I can call this method anywhere in this class. Or in other words, the class scope contains all of the instance variables and all of the instance methods that are defined inside the class. So I could call calc area within another method. I could call it within a method nested inside of a method. I could nest it inside of a block, nest inside of a block. You can get to this method anywhere, even itself. So you can do recursive methods like you can in JavaScript. And then instance methods, you can similarly, like you saw me do here, I can access it here. But to get to it from outside the method, you've got to make the getter method with attr reader. Any questions so far about scope levels? And we'll probably have a chance to see some of this in the wild when we get into the dev2 code. So, because this is all going to become relevant when I trace the data path for articles, which is what I'm going to use as an example.
It's definitely a little different that you can access methods that you create on classes across or from outside the class, I guess, without using the dot notation. Like it's just kind of like a globally accessible.
Well,
I don't think that's what he meant, is it?
No. So you can access methods within this class. Outside of this class, you would have to call it on an instance of that class.
Oh, I thought you were saying that it wasn't that it was accessible. What did you mean by that? I guess what were you saying about
Tristan? I think he just meant that if in the calculate area class you wanted to do some logic that used a method that existed within this class but not in this function.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Then you could just nest. You can call, just like we would say, call this dot something to call a method that existed on the class within a function of that class or a method of that.
Yeah. So if I did, so if I want to do some stuff and then add the output of calc area, this would probably break. Oh, let's turn it into a string. Let's be complete. But I can call calc area from inside another method in this class. This is more what I meant, Tristan.
Okay.
Yeah. But outside of here, if I just said another method, I'd get an error. It would say unknown local variable or something to that effect. But if
Daniel,
yeah.
Okay. I would say if you did call a method within another method that existed in that class, we
Mhm.
would use the this keyword to do it. How would you
Yep.
do it?
You don't need it. So it is, there is an equivalent idea of self to refer to the class from within a class function, or an instance method in this case. Um, don't take my word for this, but I think that there's sort of an order of operations in Ruby of like where it's looking for something by this name. So it's going to start by looking at self.calc area and trying to see if it finds something. If it can't find it on self, it looks for it on whatever parent class this class has, if it does. And in Ruby, any kind of object inherits from the object superclass. So there is always something that it is inheriting from. So it'll look there to see if its superclass has a method by that name. We don't really need to get into that at this point, but I will have some examples about that when we get into the dev2 code.
Okay.
But basically, yeah, it's sort of implied that you're looking for something by this name, a method by this name, either in this class or one of the classes that this class has inherited methods from. Does that kind of help?
Yeah,
Mhm.
there's similar equivalents in JavaScript
Cool.
in terms of inheriting from other classes. And
Got it.
I would just add, sometimes I do put the self in there just for clarity when I'm working through a method, especially recursive.
Yeah.
But then typically I'll take it out after I write it, just because it's assumed. But you can
Yeah.
always use self just as you would use this.
Yep, that's good. Yeah, and we'll see when we get into the dev2 code that it sure would clear up some things if it were always in there. But a lot of times you have to you've got to figure out where a method came from. I'll show you some examples of that in a bit. But you can make it explicit. Yeah, thanks, Ryan. All right, so I'm going to get into the MVC overview. I will open up the dev2 code along the way to sort of trace how this is working, but at the outset, I'm going to go just kind of do a high-level overview of the concepts, and then we'll walk through how it plays out in practice in the dev2 code base. So essentially, MVC, which stands for Model View Controller, is an app architecture. And the purpose of the MVC architecture is to separate responsibilities into kind of neat and tidy packages. The controller, well, let me walk through it. So your browser sends an HTTP request to the web server. It goes through sort of public files to eventually get rerouted to the routes.rb file. And if you have the dev2 project open, I would encourage you to do that. I'm going to show you where this lives. So I'm here in my dev2 project. If you go to the config subdirectory.
so I think right now, if you're sharing, you're just sharing the your window
Thank you.
with the browser.
Yes, let me get that shifted. Thanks. I will share my Atom window. Okay, can you see it now?
Yep.
All right, thanks. So in your config subdirectory, there's a routes.rb file. This is sort of the first stop on the way, like tracing what's happening on the MVC path. So the routes file has a list, and it looks really wonky in Dev2 because they're using some advanced techniques, which I'll give an overview of in a minute. But you'll see a couple of sort of the normal ones, and there's one on line 25. The routes file will look at the request that it got, and we'll try to compare it and match it to one of these routes. So you can see on line 25 we have get, so that's going to try to correspond to the HTTP request verb, and then it's got a string with a URI. In this case, it's /enter. and this is assumed to be appended to the kind of the root URL, the server domain. Yes, thank you.
Mhm.
And then there are a couple syntaxes for this part. It could either be to, or it can be hash, the hash syntax. But this string is going to be a combination of the name of a controller and the name of a action. And this will, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself, but essentially this will tell the app like, hey, go run this method on an instance of this class. And this class is always going to be a controller, and this method is always referred to as an action. So together, this is the controller action that that it's being routed, that this request is going to be routed to. And so that's sort of the first stop. And then from that point on, the controller does a lot of the work of assembling the response that is going to get sent back to the user. The first thing that it does typically is it'll try to get the data that it needs, or interact with the data that corresponds to the request. So with a GET request, it's probably going to retrieve some stuff from the database. And to do that, it relies upon the model. And the model is responsible for interacting with the database and for all data logic. So sometimes this is calculations, queries, comparisons, just kind of getting back the right stuff out of the database that the controller needs. And so this is the data logic layer. Oh, I'm back on my the Rails architecture picture, sorry. I am going to just share my screen so that you can see how I'm jumping around. Okay, so I'm looking at this. So the controller reaches out to the model interacts with the database, and we'll talk about how it does that later. It sends data back to the controller takes that data and then sends it to a view, and then the view incorporates that data into some kind of template. And then, and this is mostly when the server is handling a GET request. This isn't quite the same if it's like a post and you're creating a resource, but let's say it's a GET request. It'll send the data to the view incorporates that data into some kind of template, renders it as HTML most likely. In some cases it might be JSON if this is an API, and then that view is what the server as a whole returns back to the client. So that's MVC, really high view. Any questions about that before I dive into the specifics?
I saw some cases where on the view, right, they have certain, like, a lot of this project has like a lot of the basic structure of the pages laid out within the ERB files.
Mm-hmm.
And then a lot of the more complex, maybe weird user interaction is handled by, your React components.
Yeah.
And it looks like in the view they have like buttons and things like that users might interact with, which
Mm-hmm.
will ultimately hit other routes to generate new views. So is there kind of like,
Yep.
I see here you have this arrow going down from controller to view, but there's sort of a symbiotic relationship, or is that because it goes back through the cycle?
I think I would say, it's because it's coming back through the cycle. So Rails, and that's kind of what differentiates Rails from a React single page app, right? Whereas where React is trying to keep everything sort of in the same loop, this is a little bit more static. So Rails is serving up static resources, and I mean until you incorporate JavaScript into it, it's serving up static resources to the user, and then it's not going to make new stuff until you go through this loop again. Yeah. At least the way that we have mostly used Rails. But Dev 2 is a little weird, so it's breaking that rule by using instant click and stuff like that. I guess we can get into that in a bit.
For sure.
I really liked how Sal just referred to Rails as an HTML factory. Like the whole purpose of this whole process is to generate
yes
HTML. I don't know why I had a hard time wrapping my head around that at first, but
Yeah.
Yes, if that's helpful for anyone, I don't know if it is. But.
It was helpful for me too. Yeah. I think that was really clarifying.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into it then. So in the routes.rb file, make sure you got that open. We're going to start by anatomy of a normal. I guess I already did that. The normal hand-rolled route looks kind of like this. And so I'm going to go ahead and get into a little bit how you, oh man, we're already coming up. Okay, 10 minutes left until we need to restart this and do part 2. So the way that it works is if you want to go find where is this going next in the Rails app, you are typically going to look for a registrations controller under app/controllers. And you would expect to find it in here. In this case, yeah, here we go. So we got a registrations controller. And on this controller class, we are going to be, hang on, interface is getting in my way. In this class, you're going to look for a new method, which is here. And this is where you now are. And we'll get into the kind of breaking that down, what's in the controller in a minute. But the problem is that there are a lot of sort of shortcuts and conventions that Rails makes possible to make it easier to write lots of routes quickly for a particular resource in particular. So there are 2 like advanced techniques I think it's helpful to know about. One of them is namespace. Namespace is, it does a few things, but essentially what you need to know about it is that it will add admin to the URI, and it will also look for any resources or controllers in here under an admin subdirectory under controllers. So if we've got namespace admin, let's say we have a, none of these make a whole lot of sense to me, but I'm going to say that there is a root dashboard. I don't know. There's some complicated stuff going on here, metaprogramming wise, but you would look for the controllers under the admin subdirectory under app/controllers. There's a more clear example in the internal namespace. So with internal, we can go and we can look under, oh, it's going to prove me wrong, of course. Where am I looking? Controllers, internal. And then you can see we have, well, now I'm going to have to get into the next step. No, here's one. Here's a normal one. So in here we have post to this thing, send it to badges, award badges. So there's going to be a badges controller, and there's going to be an award badges function that's going to be called. And then the way that resources works is that it, because Rails is geared towards RESTful routing, there are typically going to be the 7 RESTful routes that are created for any particular database resource, which are new and create. New usually takes you to a form to input information. Create makes the resource with that information. There's index, which is show all of those of this resource. There's going to be show, which is show one specific object of this resource. There's going to be update, which is change a resource. Destroy, which is destroy it. So to speed up the process of making all those routes, instead of making developers write out 7 hand-rolled routes, you can do resources, and then the name of the model, and I'll get into this, we're getting a little bit ahead, but the name of the model that corresponds with it, and then you can tell it which of those 7 standard CRUD functions you want to create routes to. So you can see here that there's an organizations resource, and it says there only do routes for index and show. And what this is doing is making a route that is get organizations to organizations hash index and then another one for, oh, I'm sorry, this is, and then another one, and it's going to have this dynamic segment, which I'll talk about. And it's going to route that to show. So when you see resources, you can guess that there's going to be a controller for that resource, and there are going to be actions on it corresponding to these things that follow it. When it says only, it's kind of what it sounds like. The opposite is, let me see if I can find an example here. The opposite is except. So you can go, basically you can go the opposite direction from only and say, I want all of the 7 RESTful routes except for the ones that I list. So given that, and we're going to prove that, so we're going to go into internal, because we're still within the internal namespace. And I'm going to look for a organizations controller. Here it is, and it's going to have index and show actions. So that is a real quick look at how the routes work. Hit me with your questions.
I think that generally makes sense to me. So those are all the actions are then handwritten on the controller itself.
Yep.
Right. So you need to set up the ones you want to support.
Yes. Sorry, I'm bouncing around between windows because I was trying to find where all your where you all went on my screen. All right, there you are. Cool.
Neat.
You need.
No, that makes sense. It does make it a little bit more readable. So I was wondering what.
Wait.
So, and only just make sure you limit it down. This, I see a lot of these like percent sign.
Yes.
Operator floating
Yes.
around Ruby a lot.
Yeah. Let me. So this is a array literal. Is that right? Somebody correct me if I'm wrong about this, but this is Ruby makes available a lot of different ways to quickly create arrays. This one is, I think, making an array of symbols. I could Google it.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah,
Like if
so-
you go down to line 87, you see where it's like only index because it's just a single.
Yep.
Yeah. So
Yes.
yeah.
So this is what it would look like if you had one. They're using this syntax because it's faster. It's a slightly faster if you're making a longer array than doing index create, because you can put in the values without quotation marks, without anything, and then it just automatically creates an array of those strings converted into the correct data type. So there's another one for, like, you can get one for, hey, take everything in here and turn it into an array of strings. There's take everything in here and turn it into an array of integers. So when you see this syntax, that's kind of what it's doing. And if you wanted to find out what kind of data type is this converted into, I would Google Ruby array literal, and then you can get all the different ones that Ruby makes available.
Cool. Yeah,
In
sounds
In
sort of
this
similar.
case, does the I stand for like integers or something, or is that just the syntax for like breaking open that array?
Sometimes I think that they're pretty arbitrary, because like the one for
It's just an array of symbols, %i's.
Yeah, they are. The letter that it uses is pretty arbitrary, because I want to say the one for strings is W or something. So I don't think that they correspond to what you'd expect them to for whatever reason.
It's like all the way at the bottom of that document, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah, here we go. So yeah, array of symbols is I, strings is Q, regular expressions is R, S is one symbol? I don't know that one. W is an array of strings. So
in Ruby, does an array have to be the same data type? Like things in an elements in an array have to be all the same data type?
They do not. They can be different things. Usually you would want to keep them all the same thing because that makes it easier when you want to iterate on it so that you can assume that they're all going to respond to the same things. But they don't have to be.
Gotcha.
Yep. Good question.
And so but you do have to indicate what, well, I guess you don't necessarily have to indicate what you're putting in your array then. What's the value of this creating an array by sort of strongly typing it?
Just a shortcut, pretty much.